1962, Los Angeles. A private dinner where nothing is written down and everything is remembered. No reporters, no cameras, just men who understand how power actually moves, quietly, sideways, through tone and implication. Crystal glasses catch the light. Laughter comes easy. Confidence even easier. Then someone leans in and mentions the White House. Not formally, not seriously. A half smile. A remark meant only for those in the know. Frank Sinatra's name slips into the sentence like a punchline that assumes permission. The kind of joke that works only if everyone agrees the target is already finished. For a brief moment, it sounds harmless. And then Dean Martin stops smiling. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't defend anyone. He doesn't explain himself. He says one thing, calmly, precisely, and the room shuts down. Not awkwardly, completely. Forks pause mid-air. Glasses stay untouched. No one knows where to look. Because what just happened isn't disagreement. It's a boundary being enforced. And the men at that table won't realize it until much later, when they understand this wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about Sinatra. It was about how easily people learn to trade dignity for comfort, and the one man in the room who refused to play along. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The music reached Washington before the man ever did. In the winter of 1959, Frank Sinatra's voice was everywhere. Not just on radios and jukeboxes, but in hotel ballrooms where money changed hands quietly, in private homes where decisions were dressed up as dinners, in rooms where men shook hands and pretended they were doing it for the country. His concerts became fundraisers. His phone book became a political tool. He didn't just support John F. Kennedy's run for the presidency, he invested himself in it, publicly and personally, convinced that loyalty would be remembered. Back then, politics still liked to borrow glamour. It made itself look cleaner standing next to famous men in tailored suits. Sinatra understood that exchange perfectly. He believed access was a reward for effort. He believed proximity meant trust. Dean Martin watched all of this from a careful distance. He was there often enough to hear things before they reached print. Agents talked when they thought no one important was listening. Studio executives repeated whispers they'd picked up on flights back from the East Coast. And sometimes, very late, after too many drinks and not enough sleep, someone would say too much. Just enough for Dean to file it away without reacting. When Kennedy won, the mood in Hollywood shifted overnight. Sinatra expected a place in the new world he'd helped sell. Instead, something colder settled in. Calls were returned more slowly. Schedules changed without explanation. Names stopped appearing together on guest lists. The reason never came officially. It didn't need to. Everyone knew about the files, about the photographs, about the friends Frank never denied having. Sam Giancana's name floated just beneath the surface of every conversation, never spoken clearly, always present. The FBI didn't have to accuse. Robert Kennedy didn't have to explain. Distance itself became the message. The clearest signal came quietly, and that was what made it brutal. A planned visit by the president-elect to California was rerouted. The stay that had once been associated with Sinatra was reassigned. Bing Crosby's home became the safe option. Respectable, clean, unproblematic. It wasn't framed as rejection, but no one missed what it meant. Sinatra didn't read it in a headline. He heard it through intermediaries, the way powerful men are informed they've become inconvenient. Dean heard about it even earlier. Not from Frank. He didn't ask. He learned through the same back channels that now carried warnings instead of invitations. The tone had changed. People spoke carefully, as if the wrong adjective could pull them into something they didn't want to explain later. What struck Dean wasn't the politics, It was the speed. One season you were useful. The next, you were radioactive. He didn't comment. He didn't advise. He didn't offer comfort wrapped in optimism. He simply noted how quickly admiration turned into liability, how applause evaporated once it threatened the wrong people. By the time newspapers began hinting at concerns and associations, the decision had already been made elsewhere. Sinatra was no longer welcome near the center of power, and everyone was expected to understand that without being told. Dean did. He understood that music could open doors, but it could also mark you. And once politics decided you were a problem, it wouldn't argue. It would simply move on, leaving you standing exactly where you were when the music stopped. Dean Martin had learned long before Washington entered the conversation that visibility was never free. In the early 1960s, when politics began drifting closer to Hollywood with a salesman's smile, he felt the pull without ever stepping toward it. Invitations arrived disguised as compliments. Dinners where nothing was asked outright. Appearances where his presence would be described as natural, casual, no commitment at all. The offers were framed to sound harmless, even flattering. Just be seen. Just shake a hand. Just let the photograph exist. Dean declined them one by one. Not dramatically. Not with speeches or principles announced aloud. He simply said no, the way a man says no when he already understands the price. Sometimes he smiled and changed the subject. Sometimes he claimed a scheduling conflict that didn't need verifying. The refusals were polite enough that no one could accuse him of resistance, but firm enough that the invitations slowed. People misread it as laziness or detachment. They always did. What they missed was that Dean wasn't avoiding politics out of fear. He was avoiding it because he recognized the structure. He had watched men step into those rooms believing they were guests, only to realize later they were decorations. Useful when the picture was taken. Replaceable the moment the mood shifted. He had seen what happened to Frank. Where Sinatra charged forward emotionally, convinced that loyalty would be returned in kind, Dean stayed still. Where Frank spoke about belief and friendship, Dean listened for leverage. The contrast between them wasn't about courage, it was about exposure. Behind closed doors, with people he trusted, Dean was clearer than he ever was in public. He didn't rant. He didn't moralize. He reduced it to something simple. The moment your song becomes background noise for someone else's decisions, he said once quietly, you're not an artist anymore. You're cover. That sentence never left the room. It didn't need to. Financially, his distance made no sense. There were benefits waiting. Better access, better protection, a kind of institutional warmth that could smooth problems before they became problems. Others took that deal gladly. Some even encouraged him to reconsider, reminding him that staying neutral didn't protect you forever. Dean didn't argue. He understood the warning. He also understood the trap. Politics didn't want his opinion. It wanted his usefulness without the complications that had come with Frank. Clean hands. No history. No questions. A safer face for the same machinery. That was the moment Dean made the decision permanent. He didn't announce it. He didn't draw a line publicly. He simply stopped being available in any form that could be interpreted as endorsement. No fundraisers, no private introductions, no appearances that could later be recontextualized. To some, it looked like indifference. To others, missed opportunity. To Dean, it was discipline. He wasn't protecting a career. He was protecting authorship, the right to belong only to his work, not to outcomes he couldn't control. Watching Sinatra navigate the fallout taught him what proximity to power actually cost. Not money, not reputation, something quieter. Choice. By the time people realized Dean Martin would never step into that world, it was already too late to persuade him. He had moved aside deliberately, not as retreat, but as position. And that silence, carefully maintained, would soon be tested. The dinner was meant to feel familiar. A private room. Old faces. Expensive bottles opened too early, as if confidence itself needed lubrication. These were men who had known one another long enough to stop performing courtesy, long enough to believe the room was safe. The kind of night where names were dropped carelessly, where history was treated like currency. Dean arrived late and stayed quiet. He always did. He took the seat offered to him, listened more than he spoke, let the rhythm of the table reveal itself before deciding whether he belonged in it at all. At first, the talk stayed light. Work, numbers, the shifting tastes of the public. Then someone mentioned Washington. Not directly. Not yet. Just a sideways reference, followed by a laugh that lingered too long. A glass was raised. Another man leaned back, comfortable enough to sharpen his tone. Sinatra's name surfaced the way it always did now, cautiously, then with increasing ease. There was no affection in it, no concern, just analysis dressed as humor. A suggestion that Frank had overestimated his leverage, that he'd confused proximity with ownership, that he'd tried to buy influence with charm and ended up paying for it with silence. Dean didn't react immediately. He didn't need to. He felt the shift before the words fully landed. This wasn't gossip. This was permission. The kind that spreads once people sense a man has lost protection. Someone summarized it neatly. Too neatly. A final sentence that framed Sinatra not as dangerous or wrong, but foolish, replaceable, a cautionary tale. Dean set his glass down. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the room anyway. He looked at the speaker, then at the others, not searching for agreement, not inviting debate. His expression didn't harden. It settled. He spoke once. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't sentimental. It didn't mention politics or loyalty or friendship. It didn't correct facts. It reframed the room itself, what was being done there, and why it was being allowed. No one interrupted him. Not because they were polite, but because something in his tone made interruption feel inappropriate, almost crude. When he finished, he didn't wait for a response. He stood, adjusted his jacket, nodded once, not in apology, not in farewell, and left. The door closed softly behind him. No one filled the space he left. A man reached for his drink and missed. Another stared at the table as if expecting the wood to offer direction. Someone tried to laugh it off, but the sound fell flat, unfinished. The conversation didn't recover. It couldn't. The balance had shifted, and everyone knew it. What unsettled them wasn't what Dean had said. It was what he had refused to do. He hadn't argued. He hadn't pleaded Frank's case. He hadn't asked for restraint. He had reminded them, without naming it, that there was a line, and that they had just crossed it casually, comfortably, believing there would be no consequence. Long after the plates were cleared, the room stayed quiet. And for the first time, it was clear. Dean Martin wasn't staying out of politics because he didn't understand power. He was staying out because he understood exactly how it erased people, and how easily others learned to participate once they believed it was safe to do so. After 1962, nothing ended for Frank Sinatra all at once. That was the cruel part. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no moment he could point to and say, "This is when it happened." The withdrawal came in fragments, spread thin enough to be denied, but steady enough to be felt. Calls went unanswered. Then they stopped being returned at all. Invitations that once arrived automatically were now under review, then quietly forgotten. People who had once made room for him at tables suddenly had reasons not to be in town. When he did run into them, the conversations were brief, friendly, and carefully empty. The press didn't attack him directly. It didn't have to. Instead, small items appeared. Unnamed sources, vague concerns, old associations mentioned without context. Nothing actionable. Nothing he could challenge. Just enough to remind everyone that proximity to him now required explanation. Sinatra understood the mechanics. He had lived too long in public life not to recognize coordinated distance when he saw it. What hurt wasn't the loss of access. It was the realization that loyalty had a shorter shelf life than usefulness. He didn't lash out. He couldn't afford to. Any public reaction would be framed as confirmation, any denial as panic. Silence was the only move available, and even that felt like surrender. Dean watched all of this without commentary. Reporters tried to pull him into it, gently at first. A sentence here, a supportive remark there, something that could be read as solidarity without naming sides. Dean declined every time. Not evasively, simply, consistently. Behind closed doors, his presence mattered more. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't pretend the situation would correct itself. He showed up, sat with Frank when the evenings stretched too long. Let him talk without steering the conversation toward optimism or blame. When Sinatra spiraled, not publicly, but in the private way men do when pride collides with reality, Dean didn't interrupt. One night, an invitation arrived for an industry event. It was framed as light-hearted, a roast-adjacent affair. Jokes expected. Someone mentioned, casually, that Sinatra's Washington chapter might make good material. Dean read the card once and set it aside. He didn't explain his refusal to anyone. He didn't call Frank to make a point of it. He simply didn't attend. The absence was noted. The message was understood. This was how Dean operated. Not as a defender, not as a savior, but as ballast. He didn't try to pull Sinatra back into a world that had decided to let him go. He made sure he didn't drift alone. The system moved on the way systems always do, efficiently and without sentiment. Sinatra remained powerful, talented, formidable. He was not broken, but he was changed. The illusion of immunity had been stripped away. Dean never said a word about that either. He had no interest in narrating another man's fall, or in offering himself as contrast. What mattered to him was something quieter, refusing to participate in the erasure, refusing to laugh when it became fashionable, refusing to turn survival into spectacle. In a business that rewarded noise, Dean Martin chose steadiness. And in that stillness, Frank Sinatra found something politics could never offer: a witness who didn't disappear when the doors closed. The offer reached Dean indirectly, the way careful propositions always did. No letterhead, no official request. Just a conversation that drifted in his direction through people who knew how to sound casual while measuring reactions. Someone close to Washington had noticed him. Not as a replacement, they were quick to say, just as an alternative. Cleaner, easier. A man without unresolved complications. "You're different," one of them said, as if it were praise. "You keep things simple." Dean understood immediately what was being suggested. Not an endorsement, not a role, an opening, a relationship that could be defined later, once trust had been established and expectations clarified. It was framed as distance from Sinatra, not betrayal, a subtle distinction meant to make refusal feel unnecessary. He didn't answer right away. That night, alone, he considered the shape of the offer, what it would change. what it would smooth. There was no denying the advantages. Access carried weight. Protection mattered. Influence, even indirect, could redirect problems before they grew teeth. He knew men who had built entire second acts on far less. But he also knew the cost wouldn't be stated up front. What they wanted wasn't his voice or his opinion. It was his absence from certain conversations, his neutrality when names came up, his willingness to let silence do the work where refusal would draw attention. They wanted him useful and invisible when necessary. Dean chose clarity. When he declined, he did it in a way that left no edge to negotiate, no offense taken, no future reconsideration implied. He thanked them for the thought, expressed respect, and closed the door so cleanly it couldn't be reopened without noise. After that, the inquiries stopped. Later, in a quiet exchange with someone he trusted, Dean put words to the decision, not as justification, but as explanation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize it. Power doesn't want partners, he said. It wants permission. He explained that once an artist becomes convenient to authority, the work stops belonging to the audience. It becomes context, atmosphere, something played while other decisions are made. And when that usefulness ends, so does the protection. He had watched it happen too closely to mistake it for coincidence. This was why he cut conversations short, why he redirected questions before they formed, why he never let admiration turn into obligation. He wasn't disinterested. He was disciplined. Dean knew people would misread it. Some already had. They thought he was cold, disengaged, floating above consequence. In truth, he was paying attention to every signal and choosing which ones not to answer. What unsettled him most wasn't what politics did to men like Sinatra. It was how quickly everyone else adjusted, how easily friendships were reframed as risks, how laughter found new targets once protection shifted. He refused to learn that skill. By the end of that year, his position was set. No alliances, no quiet understandings, no role in the background of decisions that would later disown him. He remained exactly where he wanted to be, close enough to see the machinery, far enough not to be pulled inside. Those who still approached him sensed the boundary. They didn't push. Dean had made it clear without ever announcing it. And somewhere beneath all of it, unspoken but steady, was the knowledge that this restraint was leading toward something final. Not a statement, an action. One that would be taken without witnesses and understood only after it was too late to reinterpret. By the mid-1960s, the question no longer came directly. It circled. Journalists stopped naming names and started shaping sentences. Some people say, "There's a feeling in certain circles. You've been around long enough to have seen it." The tone was careful, almost respectful, but the intention was clear. They weren't asking for information. They were waiting for a crack. Dean recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen it used on others. Pressure applied not through confrontation, but through repetition. The same subject approached from different angles, softened each time, until silence itself began to look suspicious. Industry people joined in, often unintentionally. A producer mentioned that the political years were coming back into discussion. An agent warned that avoiding comment could be interpreted as position. Friends suggested gently that a neutral statement might close the chapter. Dean heard all of it and said nothing. He understood the trap better than they did. Any answer would be stripped of tone, reduced to a phrase, set against a headline it was never meant to serve. Even refusal could be framed as judgment. Silence was the only response that couldn't be edited. At a closed event in Los Angeles, no cameras, No press passes, only familiar faces. Someone tried again. It wasn't aggressive. It was almost friendly. A question posed as nostalgia, wrapped in laughter, followed by a pause that invited participation. Dean felt the room lean forward. For the first time in years, he altered his rhythm completely. He ended the conversation mid-flow, excused himself without explanation, left before anyone could recover the moment. The abruptness unsettled people more than anger ever would have. After that night, he changed his availability. Interviews were shortened, then declined. Appearances became selective. When topics drifted toward politics, he redirected them with such efficiency that eventually no one tried. To some, it looked like fatigue. To others, aloofness. In reality, it was containment. Dean understood that control didn't come from speaking last. It came from refusing to enter the exchange at all. He had seen how public commentary became a substance others could mold, reshape, weaponize. This was the one form of authority still fully his. He wasn't avoiding responsibility. He was rejecting the premise that he owed anyone an explanation for what he hadn't done. He had never sought proximity to power, never profited from it, never used it as currency. There was nothing to clarify, only pressure to perform clarity for someone else's benefit. The silence held, and in that space, something else became visible. Those who had once pressed him for words began to drift away. Not in anger, in disinterest. Without reaction to exploit, there was no reason to continue. Dean noticed and accepted it. He had made his choice years earlier, quietly, deliberately. This was simply the cost coming due. The narrowing of access, the absence of invitations, the calm that followed when expectations dissolved. What no one realized was that this withdrawal wasn't the end of the story. It was preparation. Dean wasn't retreating. He was creating distance so complete that when he acted, not spoke, not commented, not hinted, there would be no confusion about motive. The world was waiting for a statement. He was preparing something else entirely. By the end of the decade, the noise had thinned. Frank Sinatra was still Frank Sinatra, the voice intact, the presence undeniable. But the world around him had shifted permanently. He never returned to the place where phone calls were answered before the second ring, where power waited for his approval disguised as friendship. He rebuilt, carefully, on his own terms. What was lost was never openly mourned, only quietly acknowledged by those who knew how high he'd once stood. Dean Martin stayed where he had always placed himself, just outside the frame. The final gesture came without witnesses and without drama, which was exactly the point. A conversation was proposed. One last attempt to gather perspectives, reassess old tensions, revisit names that still made people lower their voices. It was framed as historical housekeeping. No statements, no press, just clarity, they said. Closure. Dean declined. Not abruptly, not emotionally. He didn't argue that the moment had passed or that the damage was done. He didn't reference Sinatra or politics or loyalty. He simply refused to participate in any exchange where reputations were discussed as material. That refusal ended more than the conversation. It ended the assumption that his silence could be interpreted later. From that point on, the door was closed completely. No more background inquiries, no more invitations masked as reflection, no more opportunities to help set the record straight. The line he had drawn years earlier was now final. No one announced it. No one needed to. The significance of that choice only became clear in hindsight. That dinner years earlier, the unfinished laughter, the way the room had emptied of certainty the moment Dean stood up and left. That wasn't impulse. It was rehearsal. He had understood then what others only realized later, that dignity doesn't argue. It withdraws. Dean never defended Sinatra publicly because he never accepted the premise that defense was required. He refused to let politics define who deserved respect and who could be reduced to cautionary shorthand. He protected something more fragile than a reputation, the boundary where a person stops being useful and starts being disposable. The last image isn't applause or reconciliation. It's a quiet absence. Dean leaving early, conversations pausing, people unsure whether to continue without adjusting their tone. A sense, lingering longer than comfort allows, that something essential has just exited the room. Years later, those who were there would remember that silence differently. Some as judgment, some as loyalty, some as avoidance. They were all wrong. It was authorship. Dean Martin chose not to explain himself because explanation would have handed control to others. Instead, he let the pause stand. He let it do the work words never could. And long after the voices faded, that pause remained, heavy, unresolved, and impossible to repurpose. Not a conclusion, a boundary, one that still holds.